Have you ever noticed how a single sentence can leave your mouth before you've even decided to say it? Sorry, I just had a lot going on. When nobody asked, when nobody is owed anything, when the silence after a simple no suddenly feels unbearable, and you rush to fill it with reasons, with context, with apology dressed up as explanation, you feel it happen almost before you're aware of it. Someone asks why you left early, why you didn't answer the phone, why you chose this over that. And before your mind even finishes the thought, I don't actually need to answer this, your mouth has already started constructing the defense. It feels automatic. It feels polite. It feels somehow like the price of being a good person. But what if that reflex, the compulsive need to explain yourself, isn't politeness at all? What if it's something far older, far deeper, something installed in you long before you had any say in the matter? What if every unnecessary explanation you've ever given was actually a small, quiet transaction, a payment made to keep yourself safe in the eyes of someone else? This is where Carl Jung's work becomes uncomfortable, because Jung didn't just study dreams and symbols and myths. He studied the architecture of the self. And buried deep within that architecture, he found something he called the persona, the mask a person builds, piece by piece, to be acceptable to the world around them. And one of the persona's primary functions, Jung observed, is justification. The mask doesn't just present you, it defends you, it explains you, it apologizes for you constantly to an audience that, more often than not, was never actually watching. Picture for a moment a man named David. David is 34 years old. He works in an office that, from the outside, looks like any other. Fluorescent lights, glass partitions, the low hum of keyboards. But inside David's mind, every single day operates like a courtroom. Every decision he makes, what time he leaves, how he phrases an email, whether he speaks up in a meeting or stays quiet, passes through an invisible jury before it's allowed to happen. The jury isn't real. No one assigned it to him. But David built it himself, plank by plank, starting decades ago, and he has never once questioned whether it should still be sitting there. When David was 8 years old, he came home from school with a drawing he'd made, something strange and imaginative, full of creatures that didn't exist anywhere except in his head. He remembers with startling clarity even now the exact moment he held it out to his father, and the exact moment his father glanced at it, frowned slightly, and said, "What is this supposed to be?" It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even meant as criticism. But David, in that instant, learned something that would shape the next 26 years of his life. Things you create, things you feel, things you do, they require a reason. And if the reason isn't good enough, you will be found lacking. From that day forward, David didn't stop creating. He didn't stop feeling, but he started explaining. He started building, brick by brick, an internal narrator whose only job was to translate every choice he made into something defensible, something that could survive the frown, the raised eyebrow, the "what is this supposed to be?" By the time David was an adult, the narrator never stopped. It explained why he was late. It explained why he was early. It explained why he wanted to be alone. And then, in the next breath, explained why he didn't want to be alone anymore. It explained his career choices to relatives at dinner parties, his relationship status to co-workers, his silence to friends who hadn't even asked why he'd gone quiet. And here is the strange part, the part that Jung would have circled in red ink. David believed completely that this constant explaining was a form of honesty, a form of openness, a form of connection. But it wasn't connection. It was defense. Because, and this is crucial, explanation only becomes compulsive when somewhere, deep inside, you believe that the raw, unexplained version of you is not enough, that who you are, stripped of context and justification, would be rejected. And so the explanation becomes a kind of armor. Every because is a brick in a wall. Every I just thought that is a small surrender, a tiny admission that you don't quite believe you're allowed to simply be, without first proving that your being is acceptable. Jung had a name for the part of the psyche responsible for building this wall. He called it the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The persona isn't fake exactly. It's not a lie. It's a function, a necessary interface between the deep, often chaotic interior of a person and the social world they have to survive in. Everyone needs some version of a persona. You can't walk into a job interview and simply pour out your unfiltered unconscious onto the table. But Jung's warning, and it is a warning, make no mistake, was this: the danger isn't having a persona. The danger is becoming it. The danger is forgetting that the mask was ever a mask at all, and instead living as though the explanations, the justifications, the endless performance of acceptability are who you are. And once that happens, something terrible occurs almost without your noticing. You stop asking, "What do I want?" and start asking only, "What can I defend?" If you're watching this and something in your chest just tightens slightly, drop a single word in the comments. Just one word that describes what that tightness feels like. You don't have to explain it. In fact, that's the whole point. Now here's where Jung's framework gets genuinely disturbing, because he didn't believe this compulsive justifying was simply a personal habit, something picked up from one frowning father or one critical teacher. He believed it was structural, built into the architecture of how a self forms inside a family, inside a society, inside any system where approval is conditional. Every child, Jung observed, develops in an environment where certain parts of themselves are met with warmth and other parts are met with withdrawal. A flicker of disappointment, a moment of silence, a subtle, "What is this supposed to be?" And because children are, by nature, almost entirely dependent on the approval of the adults around them for their sense of safety, they learn quickly and at a level far below conscious thought which parts of themselves are safe to show and which parts must be hidden, modified, or explained away. Jung called the hidden parts the shadow. But what's less often discussed is what happens to the parts that remain visible, the parts that were allowed to exist, but only on the condition that they come with a justification attached. These parts don't disappear into the shadow. They stay in the light, but they become tethered. Every time they emerge, they drag the justification along with them, like a chain. This is why David doesn't just avoid talking about the parts of himself that were rejected outright. He also can't simply act on the parts of himself that were tolerated, not without first attaching a reason, a context, a defense. His creativity is still there. His desire for solitude is still there. His instincts, his preferences, his no. They're all still there. But none of them can move without first being explained, because somewhere inside him, the 8-year-old boy is still standing there, holding out a drawing, waiting to find out whether it's allowed. But here's what Jung discovered next. And this is the part of his work that the popular versions of psychology almost never talk about, because it's uncomfortable in a way that doesn't fit neatly into a self-help quote. Jung discovered that the people most addicted to explaining themselves are very often not surrounded by people who are actually demanding explanations. Read that again. The jury, in most cases, isn't even in the room anymore. The father who frowned at the drawing might be retired or elderly or dead. The teacher who rolled her eyes might not even remember David's name. And yet the courtroom remains fully staffed, fully operational, running 24 hours a day, inside David's own head. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the psyche as something that doesn't simply react to the world, but constructs an internal world that often persists long after the external conditions that created it have changed entirely. The explanations David gives every day aren't really for his co-workers or his friends or his family. They're offerings made to a tribunal that exists only in memory, a tribunal David himself keeps in session because some part of him is terrified of what might happen if the courtroom ever shut down. And what would happen if it shut down? This is where the story takes a turn, because to understand what comes next, you have to look not just at fictional characters like David, but at Jung himself, and at one of the most consequential ruptures in the history of psychology. In the early 1900s, Carl Jung was, by every external measure, set for life. He was the chosen successor of Sigmund Freud, the brilliant young Swiss psychiatrist that Freud himself had once called his crown prince, the man destined to carry psychoanalysis into the future. Jung had status. He had Freud's approval, which in the psychoanalytic world of that era was the single most valuable currency that existed. To have Freud's endorsement was to have arrived. But Jung had begun to notice something inside himself that he couldn't ignore, a growing conviction that some of Freud's central ideas, particularly the insistence that nearly everything in the unconscious traced back to repressed sexuality, didn't match what Jung was actually seeing in his patients, in mythology, in religious symbolism, across cultures that had never been in contact with one another. Jung was encountering something broader, patterns, archetypes, a kind of collective psychic inheritance that Freud's framework had no room for. And so Jung faced a choice that, on the surface, looked simple, but which carried an almost unbearable psychological weight. Stay inside Freud's framework, keep the approval, keep the status, keep the explanations flowing in a direction that would keep the relationship intact, or follow what he was actually seeing, even if it meant the end of the most important professional relationship of his life. He chose the second path, and the cost was severe. The break with Freud, which became final around 1913, didn't just end a friendship. It exiled Jung from the psychoanalytic establishment that had defined his professional identity. Former colleagues turned against him. He was, in certain circles, treated as a heretic. And in the years that followed, Jung entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period so disorienting, so psychologically intense, that some biographers have described it as bordering on a breakdown. He recorded strange visions. He had dreams that disturbed him for years. He kept what would later become known as the Red Book, a private record of an inner journey so raw that he didn't allow it to be published in his lifetime. And here is the detail that matters most for understanding what happens when someone stops explaining themselves. During this period, Jung largely stopped trying to justify himself to the psychoanalytic world. He didn't write furious rebuttals to every critic. He didn't spend his energy trying to win back Freud's approval or convince the establishment that he was still one of them, still acceptable, still safe to endorse. Instead, he turned inward. He began the long, often frightening process of mapping his own psyche without an audience, without external validation, without the courtroom he had spent his career performing for. And it was during this period, not before it, not in spite of it, but because of it, that Jung developed the ideas that would define his life's work. The collective unconscious, the archetypes, the process of individuation, the shadow, the very framework that allows us, a century later, to even have this conversation, to talk about personas and masks and the compulsion to explain, exists because Jung, at the most professionally catastrophic moment of his life, stopped explaining himself to the people who had once defined his worth. This is the paradox sitting at the center of everything. The moment you stop seeking approval is the moment you become truly dangerous to those who once controlled you, not because you attack them, not because you fight back, but because you simply stop showing up to the courtroom, and a courtroom with no defendant has no power left at all. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing decades before Jung but read closely by him, described a similar trajectory in his own brutal, uncompromising language. Nietzsche wrote about what he called herd morality, the set of values that a community uses, often unconsciously, to keep its members predictable, controllable, and safe to be around. Herd morality doesn't punish you for being bad, necessarily. It punishes you for being unpredictable, for doing things the herd cannot easily categorize, justify, or explain to itself, and so the herd trains its members, from childhood onward, to pre-explain themselves, to submit voluntarily a kind of constant report. Here is what I did. Here is why I did it. Here is why it fits within the boundaries you've already approved. Nietzsche's call, "Become who you are," sounds on the surface like a simple piece of self-help wisdom, but in context, it's far more radical than that. Because becoming who you are necessarily means, at some point, doing something the herd did not pre-approve, saying something that cannot be immediately filed under an acceptable category. Making a choice that requires no because, a choice that simply is, the way weather is, the way a tide is, requiring no permission and no defense. Nietzsche believed most people never get there. He believed most people spend their entire lives performing a self that has been pre-approved by others, mistaking the performance for their actual identity, exactly the trap Jung described with the persona arrived at from a completely different direction, decades apart, by two minds who were each, in their own way, trying to answer the same question. What does it cost to be acceptable, and is the cost worth paying? There's an old idea, much older than either Jung or Nietzsche, that circles this same truth from yet another angle. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, once an enslaved man who became one of the most influential teachers in the ancient world, built his entire philosophy around a single distinction: the difference between what is in your control and what is not. Your actions, your choices, your judgments, these are yours. But other people's opinions of those actions, their approval or disapproval, their frown or their smile, their willingness to accept your reasons or reject them, that has never been in your control, not once, not ever. And yet, how much of your life, Epictetus might ask, have you spent trying to control the uncontrollable? How many explanations have you offered? How much energy have you spent attempting to manage something that was never yours to manage in the first place? Another person's internal reaction to your existence? Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who carried Epictetus's teachings into his own private journal, what we now call Meditations, wrote to himself again and again reminders not to be disturbed by the opinions of others, not to need their approval, not to perform for an audience that, in the end, has no real stake in his choices at all. And remember, this was a man who, in theory, had to answer to no one. He was the most powerful person in the known world. And still, he had to remind himself daily not to fall into the trap of seeking validation he didn't even need. If an emperor with absolute power still had to fight this instinct, what does that tell you about how deep it runs? There's a concept in Eastern philosophy, particularly within Taoist thought, that offers a different texture to this same idea, Wu Wei, often translated as non-action, though that translation misses the point almost entirely. Wu Wei doesn't mean doing nothing. It means acting without the friction of self-justification, moving the way water moves, the way a tree grows, without an internal committee convening first to approve the growth. A river doesn't explain why it bends around a rock. It simply bends. A tree doesn't defend its decision to grow toward the light. It simply grows. The Taoist sages weren't suggesting that humans abandon thought or responsibility, but they were pointing at something Jung would later describe in psychological terms, that there is a mode of being where action and identity are unified, where the gap between who you are and what you do closes completely, and in that gap's absence, the need for explanation simply has nothing left to attach itself to. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not becoming a different person, not becoming better in some moral sense, but becoming undivided, becoming someone whose inner life and outer life are no longer separated by a courtroom, a translator, a constant stream of justifications working to bridge the gap between the two. So, what happened to David? David's turning point didn't arrive as a dramatic confrontation. It arrived, almost absurdly, in a small moment. A co-worker asked him, in a slightly accusatory tone, why he'd left a meeting early the previous week, and David, out of pure habit, opened his mouth to begin the familiar performance. "Well, I had actually. The thing is, I just felt like, because..." And then, mid-sentence, he simply stopped. Not out of defiance, not out of some sudden burst of confidence. He stopped because, for the first time, he heard himself. He heard the apologetic tone, the scrambling, the tiny version of himself shrinking to fit into whatever shape might be acceptable to a person who, frankly, didn't actually care that much about the answer. He looked at his co-worker and said simply, "I needed to leave." That was it. No because, no softening, no offering. And the strange thing, the thing David expected least, is that almost nothing happened. His co-worker shrugged, said, "Oh, okay," and moved on to something else entirely. The courtroom David had been performing for, in that moment, had no verdict to give, because it turned out there had never really been a courtroom there at all. Just David, and a question, and a silence that he had always rushed to fill. That night, David noticed something he hadn't felt in years, a strange, quiet exhaustion lifting just slightly, like a held breath finally released. Not because anything outside him had changed, but because, for one small moment, he had let himself exist without a defense attached. This is what Jung meant when he described individuation as a kind of confrontation, not with the world, but with the internal structures that have, until now, stood in for the world. Most people never realize that the approval they've spent their lives chasing isn't even being requested anymore. The people who once required justification have moved on, grown old, stopped paying attention, or simply never cared as much as the story in your head insists they did. And yet the courtroom remains in session, not because it's needed, but because some part of you is afraid of who you'd be if you let it close. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The people most invested in keeping your internal courtroom running are very often not strangers. They are the people closest to you, the ones who, consciously or not, have built their relationship to you around your willingness to explain, to justify, to remain predictable and accountable to their expectations. When you stop explaining yourself, something shifts in those relationships. Some people will be relieved. They never needed the explanations in the first place, and your constant offering of them was, in its own way, exhausting for everyone involved. But others, the ones who relied on your need for approval as a kind of leverage, whether they realized it or not, will feel the shift as a loss of control, and they may push back. They may ask, more pointedly than before, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you explain?" Not because they need the information, but because your silence has revealed something they'd rather not see, that they never had as much power over you as they believed. This is the moment you stop seeking approval, is the moment you become truly dangerous to those who once controlled you. Not dangerous in the sense of threat or harm, but dangerous in the sense that a key has stopped fitting a lock that used to open easily. You haven't attacked anyone. You've simply stopped handing over the explanation that used to function as a kind of currency, a kind of leash, a kind of quiet tax paid for the privilege of being left alone. Jung's ultimate conclusion, after decades of clinical work and his own confrontation with the unconscious, was this: a person cannot become whole, while a significant part of their energy is permanently allocated to managing the perceptions of others. Wholeness, individuation, requires withdrawing that energy, not in a single dramatic act, but in 1,000 small moments like the one David experienced in that office hallway. 1,000 small refusals to perform, 1,000 small silences where an explanation used to live. What does this mean for your life today? It means noticing, really noticing, for the first time perhaps, how often you offer explanations that were never requested. Not the explanations that genuinely serve communication, the ones that build understanding between people who care about each other. Those are different. Those are connection. What Jung is pointing at is the other kind, the reflexive, anxious, preemptive justification that exists only to manage how you're perceived, offered to people who, more often than you'd like to admit, never asked and never needed to know. It means recognizing that every time you catch that reflex, and choose instead to let a no stand alone, to let a choice exist without a defense, to let silence sit in a space where explanation used to live, you are not being rude or cold or withholding. You are doing something Jung considered one of the most difficult and most necessary acts a person can perform. You are closing the courtroom, not forever, not all at once, but enough each time to feel the weight of a chain you didn't even know you were carrying lighten, just slightly. And so here is the question Jung leaves you with, the question that, once heard, has a way of returning to you at strange moments, in the middle of a sentence you're about to over-explain, in the pause before you say, because. If no one was actually asking, who exactly have you been answering to all this time?